The wind tore at the loose boards of the feed room, rattling them like teeth. Jonah Hale looked up from the rope he was coiling and froze. Light cut through the gaps in the barn wall, and through that light a figure stumbled in. A woman in a travel-worn dress, hair tangled, a shawl clutched about her shoulders. She sank to the ground between the hay bales, as if the cold had reached into her bones and settled there. Snow hissed against the eaves outside. The lantern at Jonah's elbow guttered. Then Hope, his oldest, 10 and fierce as a stray, snatched it and moved forward, her small hand steadying the flame. Jonah's hands, calloused and steady for a dozen years, trembled now. He had not let himself be surprised by a woman's presence since the fever took Ruth the first winter he ran the place alone. He had learned to measure his days in chores and silence, to mend harnesses and hold his children when nightmares came. The farm ran by the precision of muscle and habit. There was no room for questions that opened old wounds. Her face was pale under the lantern light, not the frozen white of a corpse, but the kind of paleness that belonged to someone who'd kept their sorrow inside until the skin forgot how to blush. Her dress was threadbare but clean enough once the dust brushed off. Her eyes were a startling gray, sudden and clear. When she turned her head, Jonah saw the bruise along her jaw and the small, stubborn set to her mouth. "You all right?" he asked, voice rough with tobacco and years of saying nothing. She tried to laugh and it broke apart. "I think I walked out of a storm into another," she said, her words slurred with cold. "Please, They left me at the depot. There was—" She stopped, swallowed. Her breath came ragged. "No money, no place to go." Hope glanced at Jonah with a look that made him unsteady. Tommy, 7, stood at his side like a weathered little sentinel. Jonah moved, because he always moved when his children needed it. He found a blanket and wrapped it around the woman's shoulders. Up close, she smelled of sour coffee and bleach, the odd mix of a woman who had been scrubbed to survive judgment. "What name you go by?" Jonah asked, because names mattered on this land. They were how people anchored themselves when the weather wanted to drag them out forever. "Eve," she said, then paused. "Eve Mercer." He didn't know that name from anywhere around here. It didn't matter. He'd learned how to take people at the measure of what they did, not what a letter spelled. "You're welcome to warm," he told her. "We'll feed you." "There's always work." She closed her eyes like prayer, and the tightness that had lived in Jonah's chest the last 3 winters loosened in the simple act of being needed. He had promised himself something the night Ruth died, to protect his children from more sorrow than the world could throw. Promises were sharp things, not always easy to keep. By dusk they'd moved her by the stove, poured a mug of coffee into her hand. She drank like a drowning person. The children kept a watchful quiet, offering pieces of bread and small smiles. Jonah watched her fingers tremble over the mug. There was a heaviness in her shoulders like a pack of unspoken things. He could have shut the door, left the world of kindness to strangers to somebody else. Instead, he sat a little further away from the fire and let the ache in his chest do what it wanted, feel and not run. When she finally spoke, her story was not short. She had taken a train west because a man had written to her. A man with promises, and a name and a picture. A man who, when she stepped from the train and stood on church steps with a shawl and a heart half full of hope, had looked at her and turned away. His family, the kind that kept farms and reputations, had decided she wasn't the sort of woman they wanted inside the house. The preacher's wife had offered a lift to the depot, but no more. She'd walked until the roads stopped being roads and the snow ate the tracks. She'd been turned away because of something about her that made men nervous. She could not provide what a husband might want. Somewhere in the litany a doctor had told her words that scraped. "It would be difficult. You may not carry." The groom's face when he'd been told had been the face of someone deciding on a bargain and finding the goods lacking. Jonah heard it and felt a fist close inside his ribs. Men here liked simple things. Labor, lineage, a woman who could raise a child and bake and keep the house from becoming a place of sadness. He had learned the hard way that life did not always follow what men liked. He had known loss and the way a man measures himself by what he fails to save. He had known the silent shake of the earth when grief arrives. You'll stay till the thaw, Jonah said finally, because the children needed warmth and human kindness like seed needs rain. You'll work. You can mend, maybe help with the cooking. She blinked, surprised as a bird. You would have me? Only if you want to, Jonah said. He felt ridiculous saying that, like a man asking permission from ghosts. There's a room. You can sleep near the stove. They made a place for her. She knelt each morning to scrape the blackened bottom of the cast-iron pan and make coffee for the family. She learned the names of the horses, talked to the chickens when they refused to lay. She sang, a low sort of song that had no words at first, then began to form into lullabies that Tommy took like treasure. Through the small rituals of daily life, the household softened. There were mornings when Jonah found himself waiting at the top of the stairs for the sound of her boot against the wooden slat. He felt guilty for the thing he could not name, as though witnessing the tilt of his chest when she entered the kitchen made him less righteous. The town noticed. Small towns are hungry for stories, and this one set its teeth around something to chew. A man at the general store made the kind of remark that should have been private. A woman in church dropped a look that carried the chill of winter. Jonah heard whispers slice like loose wire. For a man who had learned the hard skill of indifference, the town's attention felt like an attack. "Don't bring trouble to our door," murmured one of the men at the co-op. They meant keep the house clean of scandal, keep the children's names unsoiled. The idea of a stranger, a woman who arrived by train with no kin, and a rumor tied to her like twine, under the hail roof made some mouths pucker. Jonah kept his jaw tight and his head down. He had lost his temper before, and seen what it did to children's eyes. The memory kept him careful. But silence is a kind of speech too, and when the church elder stood and called attention to the matter, Jonah felt the air shift under his feet. "Jonah Hale," the elder said, voice timbered with the seriousness of someone saying things in the Lord's house. "We must consider the upbringing of the young. A man alone. Well, it's not like how God meant it." Jonah's face felt like a mask. People believed what they wanted because belief is warm and worn. He stood when the elder's words hit the rafters and looked at the faces in the room. At the woman whose son had once been Jonah's friend. At the woman who kept the choir book like a talisman. He looked lastly at the man whose scowl had the hardness of old ice. "She's been good to my children," Jonah said. His voice was small, the way a rope is small in a storm until you find the hold. "She kept them warm through the nights. She mended more than a shirt." He swallowed the rest. To say he had come to lean on her in a way that frightened him felt like stepping off a cliff. The town murmured. Jonah could feel the tilt of their judgment like wind pressing against a door. They voted. They sent the whispers onward like a flock. Warren Ketch, big, bilious, with a son who'd once tipped his hat to Jonah on market days, took to the street corners and made claims about common decency. It was the sort of campaign that did not bother with truth. "A man who keeps a woman without marriage is asking for trouble," men said over whiskey and tobacco. Women said the things women sometimes say, sharper even, because the cost of losing respect hurts more than losing a farm. The day they brought horses to the doorstep, Jonah's stomach folded into itself. The men were there, leather chaps creaking like old hinges. Ketch was the first to speak. "Hale," he said, "you know what we're here for." Jonah looked at Eve and then at his children. Hope's jaw set like a child's ready for battle. Tommy's fingers white on the brim of his hat. He felt like a gambler about to lay down his final coin. "You've some idea of what people think," Ketch continued, voice oily. "We won't have this place become a scandal. Send her back to where she came from." "It's better for the kids." Jonah's hand hovered over the gate. For a long time he'd been good at running, at tending the animals, at bending the world to the chores. To meet men on a hot day in the yard, though, felt like stepping into the kind of fight that ends bodies or reputations. He had thought himself done with that. "She ain't going nowhere," Jonah said. The words were spelled out of a kind of cold. The men shifted. "She works. She feeds my children. She stays." Ketch laughed with a sound as if he'd swallowed a string of nails. "And you put that woman up as your wife?" "Not yet," Jonah said. "Ain't nothing decided till it's decided." Ketch's nostrils flared. "We make a deal, Hale. Send her away before the thaw, and there's a world of quiet for you. Keep her and you'll find this town won't buy from you or trade with you. People keep accounts in more ways than one. Jonah could imagine losing the store credit. He could imagine lines uncrossed in ledgers, a small thing that grows teeth. But he could not imagine the look in his children's eyes if he let a stranger be walked out into the snow by men deciding what was best for them. He thought of Ruth and the way grief had hollowed the home. He thought of the lullabies that stilled Tommy's nightmares. He thought of Hope's small hand on his arm, the way she'd told him of love as if it were a treasure to be guarded. "I'll not send her out," Jonah said. "If you think to starve us out, then do your worst." Ketch spat in the dirt and turned his horse. "We don't like to tie up a man's life. Consider this your choice." They left like vultures unsatisfied. The ache in Jonah's chest swelled until it filled the room. He went inside and found Eve sitting at the table, hands pressed into a cloth as if praying. She looked up, and for a moment Jonah saw the small woman who had once been full of hope, and the hard woman who had walked the rails and stayed alive. "They'll make trouble," she said softly. "Let 'em try," Jonah replied. He felt raw and foolish and terribly human. "I ain't leavin'." The weeks crept like winter, thawing its way across the land. People kept their distance at first. A boy at school mouthed something unkind to Hope, which she answered with a look so hot it could have set his ears on fire. At the market, the shopkeeper measured out flour with a conscientiousness that spoke of measured grudges. The world is not kind, and it likes to mark its seams. But the seam held. Eve worked beside Jonah, and the household found rhythm. There were evenings when Jonah looked at the two children asleep in the loft and felt something like grace, a thread stitching over the old wound. He began, without thinking about it, to leave a plank in the barn repaired for the next day's work, or to carve a toy while the fire breathed low. His hands learned the shape of gentleness again. Not all wounds are made with same tools. Some are tongues, some are hands, some are the slow withdrawal of a town's goodwill. Then the day came when a sickness rode in like a thief at night. A fever took to the valley, swelling throats and stealing breath. The local doctor had little to offer and less time. Women who were in their last months were sickened by the cough. Barges of trouble came. People whispered of quarantines. Jonah's youngest, Tommy, woke one night with a hot forehead and eyes clouded with something fiercer than sleep. Eve bandaged him, water at hand, a pot of tea simmering over the coals. The fever clawed at the boy, and Jonah felt the old tremor, grief ringing like metal underfoot. He had lost Ruth to the fever 3 years back, and the memory of what failed him then had become a scar that never quite healed. "Hold him still," Eve murmured, expertly as though the years had been spent in infirmaries. She pressed a cool cloth against his neck and hummed a low song that Jonah did not know the words to, but it worked the way a hand does when it knows where to press. Jonah watched, helpless in the old way grief had taught him. But then he realized he wasn't helpless. He was beside a woman who moved like someone who had once been in danger and had learned how to fix what fragility allowed. Her hands were steady, her face set. The children slept, and Jonah sat with his boy, feeling the heat of the fever sink like a blade into his bones. He thought of the morning he'd promised himself not to let fear make him small. He had been small once in the church when whispered gossip had cut him to silence. He had not known then how shame could gather like fog. The fever passed in the small hours like a thief. Tommy's breathing eased. Jonah slept the sleep of the truly grateful. The town heard and stories changed. Not all at once, but like ice loosening at creek edges. People saw that the woman they'd decided to stamp as scandal had kept a child alive and quiet. Some in the congregation munched their hymns and pretended the lesson had nothing to do with them. But not everyone softened. Ketch's son took to the pasture with his friends and let loose the sort of cruelty that grows like mold. He mocked Eve in the market and threw taunts at Jonah as if to carve out a place that would justify the world's teeth. The boy's father gave him little scold. Then came the night the barn caught. A careless lantern left too near the hay, or a spark from the stove. The why didn't matter that night. Flames took the dry straw with a crackle that sounded like bones breaking. The prayer of all men then becomes quick hands and unhurried strength. Jonah smelled smoke and ran, naked to the night. The barn was full of animals, and any man knows that animals panicked are a thing to be feared for the lives they can take. Jonah fought inside the blaze, as if wresting with a heat that remembered the life it had taken from him. He saw Eve there too, her face streaked with soot, hair loose and wild, grabbing a foal, hauling it toward the yard. Someone shouted, and Jonah answered. They passed animals to one another like a chain of hands. In the center of all that burning terror, Jonah found himself moving as he had not in years, because the fire did not wait for fear. When the flames finally bowed to the cold and the men had heaved what they could save and stomped out the rest, the barn lay black and smudged with a ruin that looked like an ending. Jonah's hands were blistered and raw. He had lost tools he'd needed, hours spent rebuilding. But out in the yard, Eve sagged against the fence, hair on end, and Jonah saw the way the children's faces lit when they knew they'd not lose the horses they'd loved. "You saved," Jonah started, then choked on the words. He could not say all that burned inside. She looked at him and smiled, small and real, more like a sunrise than anything she'd ever been before. "We did what we could," she said. "We kept what mattered." Ketch, who'd ridden over with a menacing pile of companions, watched with a look that might once have been mean satisfaction. But when he saw Eve reach for a limp kitten in the grass and press it to her chest, when he watched Tom and Hope press their faces into their mother's apron as if to shield her from the ashes, something in him eased. Or perhaps the sight stabbed him in an old place where he'd always feared being owned by anything. In the weeks after the fire, help came unexpectedly. A baker from the next town brought loaves. Men Jonathans hardly knew brought lumber and saved the bones of the barn. People do not always stay true to a pious code. Sometimes they follow the simpler path of neighborliness when the world steps hard on the weak. The farm rebuilt, plank by plank, with new nails and new hands. Jonah's barn rose again, charred timbers replaced with green wood that sang under the hammer. When spring finally ground the last of the snow away, and the river began to argue with its banks, the town changed the way it looked at Jonah's home. Fewer people crossed the road to gossip. More came with tools and hands. The church elder nodded at Jonah as they passed in the lane. Ketch's face, which had once held judgment, softened in a way that suggested pride had done something negligent. It is a small miracle how the world forgives when it sees what a person will do for another. One afternoon, as the sun cut long and the air smelled of new grass, Jonah stood at the fence and watched Eve teach Hope to splice rope. Her fingers moved like a quiet carpenter's, sure and patient. Jonah felt a swell in his chest, a heavy, undeniable thing that unmoored him. He thought of Ruth, of her laugh like a low bell, of the way she had once loved him. He thought of every promise he'd made to keep himself safe from pain. He had been careful, and in that carefulness he'd become a man who measured life in the safety of avoiding love. On that fence, with his children shadowing bright, Jonah stepped across the place he'd kept fenced off. He walked up to Eve with the sort of clumsy courage that can't be learned from books. She looked up when he called her name, and something in her face opened like the first crocus. "I've been a coward," Jonah said, as if confessing to a neighbor. "I froze when I should have acted. I let the town steer me with noise instead of doing what was right for my children." Eve's hands stilled. "You kept them warm," she said. "You kept them fed." "I kept them alive," Jonah corrected. "And you made it feel like a home again. I reckon I don't want to be small no more. Not if there's any way to help it." She waited as if listening for something to land between them. The children shuffled near, pretending not to hear while their eyes were wide. "If you want to," she said finally, "I'd stay. Not for the town or the gossip. For them, for you, for—" "Don't make promises if you don't mean 'em," Jonah said, because he knew the weight of vows. "But if you'll have us, if you'll take on the noise and the quiet and the chores and the small breakfast fights and the good mornings—" Eve laughed then, a sound that scattered like warm light, and Jonah felt the room inside his chest rearrange itself. "I reckon I will," she said. They married in the pasture that summer in a ceremony that tasted of hay and dust and the kind of joy small towns meet with surprise. Elder Moses, who'd been the town's backbone for a generation, read a short blessing, and Hope walked barefoot with a sprig of wildflowers. Ketch did not attend. He passed by on his way to the next field, and Jonah did not look his way. There were faces in the crowd that had once judged. Some smiled, others averted their eyes. When Jonah and Eve stood with the children's hands between them, the whole world seemed to hold its breath and then exhale. Winter would come again, as it always did. There would be storms and arguments and the small calamities that stitch life into a pattern. But Jonah had learned how to choose the part that led toward people. He had learned how to stand when the town asked him to bend, how to let love in despite the risk of losing it. On a cold evening years after, Jonah stood at the barn door and watched the silhouettes of his children playing with a litter of kittens. Eve hummed a tune as she gathered eggs, hair tucked under a kerchief. Jonah's hands held a mug of coffee, warming of the skin it could have burned on. He remembered the night she'd staggered into the barn, and how fragile they all had seemed then. He remembered all the small acts that had built them a life. Stolen bread shared at the table, the fixing of a toy horse, a hand offered to climb back into a burned-out structure and salvage what mattered. "Papa," Hope said from the yard, "did you ever think you'd have a real home again?" Jonah looked at his daughter, then at the woman who had become the center of their weather. "I thought I'd be a man with a barn full of things and an empty room where the heart should be," he said. "But I was wrong," Eve laughed softly. "You were just waiting the right trouble," she teased. "Maybe," Jonah conceded. He lifted his mug in a small toast to the dark, the storms, and the stubbornness of people who chose each other. Outside, wolves sang in the timber like a wild hymn. The barn door stood solid. Inside, the children slept without nightmares for the most part. Love had crept in like spring watching a thaw, slow, patient, inevitable. It had not erased grief. It had made room beside it. Jonah had learned to live with both. And when the wind blew, it carried with it not the bitter edge of what he'd lost, but the warm smell of coffee and baking, and the sound of a family that had weathered the worst and chosen to stay together. The thaw came late that year. The snow hung on the hills like it had forgotten how to leave. Jonah Hale stood at the fence, his hands wrapped around the top rail, eyes tracing the slow drip of ice from the branches. It had been months since the fire. Months since the town had decided to stop whispering every time Eve's name came up. The barn stood new now, the smell of pine still fresh, beams straight and clean. He had thought rebuilding it would fix the noise in his chest, but it didn't. Eve moved through the yard with a quiet rhythm, gathering laundry from the line, hair pulled back with a scrap of blue ribbon. She had been his wife 3 months now. Not much changed in the work. There was still feed to haul, fence to mend, but the air around the house was different. Lighter, warm, even in the cold. Hope laughed more. Tommy slept without calling out in the dark. Sometimes Jonah caught himself smiling at nothing, and it startled him. The town still carried its ghosts. They always do. But something had shifted. The same men who had ridden up with threats now stopped by to trade lumber or share a drink. One even left a basket of eggs on the porch with no note. That was apology enough for Jonah. Eve had taken to keeping a small journal by the bed, where she wrote at night when everyone slept. Jonah had never asked what she wrote. It felt like prying into prayer. But sometimes, when she left the page open to dry the ink, he caught glimpses, small lines about wind, children, forgiveness. Once she had written, "Some places heal not by forgetting, but by staying." He carried that line around in his head like a coin he couldn't spend. The spring work came early. The fields needed turning. The seed had to go down before the thaw turned to mud. Eve took the team out with Jonah, her hands sure on the reins. The sky was full of crows and light, the kind that made you believe in tomorrow. They worked until the muscles in their backs ached, and when they stopped, they stood side by side, breathless, watching the sun dip behind the far hills. "You ever think about leaving?" she asked quietly. He looked at her, the lines around his eyes deep from years of sun. "Once, maybe, when Ruth died. Thought there wasn't anything left worth staying for. And now? Now I figure if the world wants to take something from me, it'll have to work harder." She smiled at that, a small, tired smile. Good, because I don't plan on going anywhere. They walked back to the house together. The air smelled of thawed earth and wood smoke. Inside, Hope was kneeling by the stove, helping Tommy patch a wooden toy horse. The small space glowed in the lantern light. Warm, human, alive. Jonah stopped at the door, watching them, and something deep in his chest turned over. He remembered the night Eve had come stumbling through the snow. Remembered thinking she looked like a ghost. Now she was more real than anything else in his world. He stepped forward, set a hand on her shoulder. She leaned into it, just enough to let him know she was there. Weeks passed. The fields greened. The barn filled with the sound of animals again. Every morning started the same way. Coffee, sunrise, the sound of Eve humming while she swept the porch. And every evening ended with her sitting by the window, pen in hand, the light of the lamp making a halo around her hair. Then came the letter. It arrived on a Tuesday, carried by a post rider from the next town. The envelope was thin, the handwriting delicate but unfamiliar. Eve's fingers trembled when she saw it. She slipped it open and read in silence, lips moving but no sound coming out. When she looked up, her eyes were wet. "It's from Illinois," she said. "From my sister. I didn't think she'd ever write." Jonah said nothing. He'd learned that some silences are softer than words. "She says our mother passed 2 winters ago." "I didn't know." She swallowed. "And that my brother. He wants me to come home. Says there's land that needs tending. That he'll help me start again." Jonah's chest went tight. "And do you want to?" Eve looked down at her hands. "I don't know. I thought I left everything there behind. But it feels strange, knowing I still have a name somewhere." Jonah nodded. He walked to the window, staring out at the hills. The wind moved over the fields like water. "If you want to go, I won't stop you." She turned toward him, voice soft but steady. "If I go, I lose this." He faced her. "And if you stay, you lose them." The room felt smaller suddenly, the air heavy. Hope and Tommy were outside, laughing at something only children could find funny. Eve stood, her chair scraping against the floor. "I don't want to choose between blood and home," she said. "Then don't," Jonah replied. "Sometimes staying's the braver thing." That night she didn't write. She sat by the fire, hands folded in her lap, eyes distant. Jonah wanted to reach out, but he didn't. Some storms have to pass without help. Days turned to weeks. The letter stayed on the mantel, unopened again, like it was waiting for a decision neither of them wanted to make. Eve worked harder than ever, like movement might drown out thought. She fixed the roof, planted herbs, even mended the church's worn banners when the pastor asked. The town had learned to trust her quiet kindness, and she gave it freely. Then one afternoon the clouds turned dark and fast. A storm rolled in from the north, wind thick with dust. Jonah was out in the lower pasture when he saw the sky shift. He shouted for Hope to bring the animals in. Eve ran to gather what she could from the line. The air snapped with static. The storm hit like a freight train. Hail pounded the ground. Jonah barely got the barn doors closed before the wind tore at them again. Eve stood beside him, hair whipping across her face. "The children!" she shouted. He turned just in time to see the tree by the house splinter, lightning hitting it square. The sound cracked the world open. He ran, heart hammering, feet sinking in mud. The door blew open as he reached it. Inside, the children were huddled under the table, eyes wide. He scooped them both up, holding them close as the storm screamed through the open door. When it passed, silence fell heavy and thick. The sky turned the color of slate, rain easing to drizzle. Jonah stepped outside, soaked through, and saw the damage. The new barn stood, but the fence was gone. Half the garden washed out. The roof of the lean-to had caved in. And Eve. She was on her knees near the porch, picking through debris, blood on her hand where a shard had caught her. He went to her, crouched down, took her hand. "You're bleeding." "I'm fine," she said, breathless, "just fixing what I can." He looked around at the wreck of their small world, the house scarred, the land torn, and felt the same old ache rise up. "You don't have to fix everything," he said quietly. She looked at him, eyes fierce. "If I stop, I'll start remembering. And remembering hurts." Jonah pulled her close, hand on the back of her head. "Then let it hurt. We'll remember together." The rain eased. The land steamed in the afterlight. Eve leaned against his chest, and for the first time since the fire, Jonah felt something lift. They rebuilt again, because that's what people do when the world tries to break them. By midsummer, the field stood green and high. Hope's hair had grown long enough to braid like her mother used to. Tommy learned how to ride without fear. The rhythm of life returned, smoother now, as if the earth itself had accepted their staying. One evening, Jonah found Eve sitting on the fence, watching the sunset paint the sky in gold and ash. She held her old letter in one hand. "I never wrote back," she said. "Maybe that's answer enough," she smiled faintly. "Maybe." She tore the letter once, twice, let the pieces drift away on the wind. "This is home now." Jonah stepped beside her, their shoulders touching. "Then home's lucky." They watched the last light fade. The sound of the children's laughter drifted from the barn, mingling with the lowing of cattle and the hum of crickets. The world was whole again, in the small, imperfect way it could be. Years later, when the children were grown and the fields thick with wheat, travelers would still talk about Jonah Hale's place, the one that had burned, flooded, and still stood. They said you could hear laughter from the yard before you saw the house. They said the woman there had eyes like storm clouds, and hands that could turn sorrow into bread. And on clear nights, when the wind came down from the timber and the wolves called to each other across the dark, Jonah would sit by the door, coffee in hand, and listen. He'd look toward the barn, where the light burned low, and think of the woman who'd once walked in from the snow, half dead and half hope. He'd think of what she gave him. Courage when he'd run out, warmth when the world froze over, and he'd smile, small and sure, because some winters don't end with the weather. They end with a person. And for Jonah Hale, that person had a name, Eve. The night would press close, the wolves would sing, and the barn, once a graveyard of loss, would glow steady in the dark. That's how home sounds when you've earned it. Not loud, just alive.